I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual.
起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬、一鞠躬、再鞠躬、三鞠躬，参加各位点传是一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
So the question was this: when did punctuation marks come into written Mandarin? So you guys recall that I always say that in ancient Chinese, classical Chinese, there were no punctuation marks. So people did not use any periods or commas or exclamations or question marks and stuff like that. They had different ways to go about it. And I'll talk about those different ways in just a moment, just to kind of refresh your memory. But so the use of punctuation marks, the Chinese learned about the punctuation marks from Westerners, from Europeans, and it was at the end of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty is the very last dynasty in China's history, and it came to an end about roughly a century ago. And that was the time when finally people taking note from what the Europeans were doing, because at that time Europeans were very powerful, very successful, dominating the world, colonizing everywhere. So, learning from that, adopting the idea, the concept of punctuation marks. So that was the rough historical backdrop of the time frame. So here's the answer. It's roughly a century ago. That's when the first book in Mandarin, in Chinese, was published that actually had punctuation marks in it in the year 1919. So if you think about it, it's the year 2018 now, so this is like 99 years ago. So prior to that, for thousands of years, there's been language in written form for 4,000 or 5,000 years prior to that. So what did people do without punctuation marks? We're so used to punctuation marks, it may be difficult to imagine what people would do without it, or without even the idea of punctuation marks. So what did they do? Well, to signify gaps, from one sentence to the next, a pause, they would put in like an empty space between sentences. So the longer the silence or the pause between sentences, the bigger that gap would be. So, you can be flexible with that. You can use a large amount of space to signify and extend the silence and extend the pause, or a relatively short gap to indicate, someone taking a breath before continuing to speak. So empty gaps was one way, and that took the place of things like periods and commas. There were also specific characters used at the end of a sentence to create various effects, such as emphasis, exclamation, question marks, etc. So here are examples, and these examples specifically are drawn from the Dao De Jing. So these will appear at the end of some sentences, and their use at the very end is to serve the same function that today we will utilize for exclamation marks and periods and so forth, and question marks. They use the character for that. Lastly, there's this thing called 句读. This is not widespread at all. This was mentioned in Wikipedia, but it may as well not be there because it's not something that you will see in a published work. It's basically something that people make themselves, and it's like, circles. It's informal marks made by the reader, customized by the reader, basically, to signify your understanding and the places where you would put in a pause in the unbroken text. So not really like the punctuation mark. It doesn't really qualify. So now I want to give everybody an example of what modern day Mandarin punctuation marks look like? Now, I think everybody pretty much has some sort of idea that when you switch to a different language, the punctuation marks can change also. One example that comes to mind is Spanish. How are punctuation marks in Spanish different than English? Any ideas? I think everybody knows, or I think a lot of people know. Well, so in Spanish, if you think about the exclamation mark and the question mark, it appears not just at the end of a sentence, but also at the beginning, but upside down. You've probably seen it. I think you have. So in any event, the point that I want to make is that even though you've got comparable punctuation marks in Mandarin, they all look a little bit different as well. So that's the reason why I want to show the next slide so you can see the difference for yourself. So this right here is just the beginning part of an essay on the three treasures, and it's basically English with Mandarin on the right hand side, and it's I have like a paragraph by paragraph correspondence, so you can tell what the different characters are. So right off the bat, if you look at the very first character in Mandarin here, it's basically three horizontal lines. So what is that character? Well, that's the character for the word three. That's one of the simplest characters. So sticking to the punctuation marks, take a look at the comma here, the first punctuation mark that we see in the Mandarin text. You'll notice that it looks pretty much the same as the English comma. The only difference is that the Mandarin comma is set in the middle of the line. You know, it's vertically and horizontally centered, whereas in English, it's toward the bottom of the line, like a subscript. And moving along, take a look at the period in Mandarin. This right here. You'll notice that it's a small circle. So unlike English, it is not a small dot, but a small circle. Then another dramatic difference is with the quotation marks. So quotation marks in Mandarin look like this. Not with the, so you can't quite make the air quotes like you can in English as you're talking. And you notice that here I'm surrounding the character Dao with quotation marks. In English, I'm not. And that's just because the way it reads in English is a little bit different than the way it reads in Mandarin. In Mandarin, you really ought to have that quotation mark around it, but in English, it doesn't feel necessary. So there you go. Those are the differences. There are other differences as well, but those are the ones that you will come across most often if you were to take on a course to study modern Mandarin. Looking further down, you can see the question mark, and that looks identical to the one that's being used in English. And we've got two more iterations of the question mark down here. It's the same thing, so you can tell. So unlike Spanish, you don't need to begin a sentence with a question mark. That's flipped upside down. It's just like the way it is in English. And if you are curious about the rest of the text, you can find it at this URL down here. It's got in-depth explanations on the three treasures. So if you haven't seen it, but you are interested in the three treasures of Guan Dao, I definitely would recommend that you give that web address a visit. This is what Bill and I were talking about at the very beginning of the meeting when he said that the situation that he encountered at work with many servers down, it was chaotic. It was a stressful situation, but he utilized the three treasures just as I would in a similar situation, and the calmness, the composure carried him through. So very useful. Okay, so that was my answer to the question about punctuation marks.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，持架深鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架各位顶传十一鞠躬，斜翻一鞠躬。Well done, everybody. Thank you so much.